Everyone to eFormation. This is Julie Lytle. I'm the Executive Director of Province 1 in the New England states. I serve the Episcopal Church's 7 dioceses there. And so I've had a lot of experience with that, and through the years, trying to bring together what I call virtual incarnations. We're not always able to bring people physically together, but there are ways we can be enfleshed and embodied with one another due to the new technologies that we have available to us. And so what today's presentation is going to do is give us a chance to think a little bit about how and why we choose to do facilitation online, and what are the different platforms available to support what we're trying to do. The picture that you're seeing in front of you is a collection of folks that are part of the Forma's Certificate in Leadership for Lifelong Christian Formation. And I'm going to use examples from the work that I do to share with you some of our experiences of what has worked and what hasn't, what our best practices have seemed to be. But I also encourage you to please participate actively, sharing your experiences with us, being able to add to the conversation so that we can get the wisdom of everyone that's both physically gathered here at Virginia Theological Seminary, as well as all of you that are online. I'm going to give a bit of a caveat. I have spent the last 14 years using an Adobe Connect web conferencing product. And so I'm quite familiar using that technology to be able to do this kind of teaching and learning. We're using Zoom, which is a new platform that I think has some very exciting possibilities for the ways we can engage one another. And I'll get into some of the reasons why you would choose one over the other as we move forward. But I hope you'll give me a little bit of generosity as we try to work through figuring out how's the best way for me to get comfortable using a new platform as we're sharing this with you. It's one of the things that I think each of us needs to think about as we're trying to facilitate conversations online. The more familiar you are with the product, the more intuitive you use it, the less the technology is a part of what you're trying to do, and the more you can engage in the relationship building and the learning and growing that you have as your goal, rather than fumbling about the technology. So it's something to really spend some time with. I encourage you, as you're learning about the different platforms, to find some friends and experiment so that you can learn and see what each of the different values of them are, and be able to get a sense of what's going to fit what your needs are and your style of teaching and learning. I also want to make a comment to the folks that are predominantly here in the room. We have 2 different types of web conferencing that are happening as a part of eFormation. In the room across the hall and downstairs, there's a setup with a web camera from a distance recording the presenter at the front of the room. And in that situation, the presenter is primarily talking to the people that are in the room and engaging them, with the happenstance of the web conference folks being a part of the conversation. The way this room has been designed, you all online are the ones who are my primary audience. The rest of the room is going to be somewhat of a passive observer, although we're going to engage them as much as possible, because I'm going to be looking at the screen, talking to you. I'm going to be demonstrating things on the screen so that you at a distance can have a good sense of what the process is for doing a presentation online. And so it's a little bit of a different way of thinking about how do you do a presentation when you have a simulcast with people that are physically present in a room as well as people who are online. And it's a little bit challenging as you're leading that conversation to try to figure out how to be attentive to both audiences to the full satisfaction of each. There's always going to be a need to try to do the simulcast presentations. And if you have a way to be able to privilege one over the other and help clarify why you're doing that, it makes it easier for everyone to know why things are happening in the way in which they're happening. So I'm inviting the folks on the screen. You all don't see, I don't think, a list of the number of participants, but there are 25 people online. 36 people online. It's grown since I took a glance. And you all are going to be able to ask questions using the chat. The folks in the room will ask you to raise your hand, and I'll be repeating things that you say in the room so that the folks online can know what the engagement is. I invite you as often as you need to tell me to slow down, to ask me to clarify something if I'm using language that's unfamiliar or concepts that I hadn't clearly presented, so that we can make sure that everyone's moving along fairly quickly, but on the same page. So with that, let's move a little bit to where things are in this presentation. Okay, let's start by getting the presentation moving. Here we go. This is a picture from the early 1980s that helps give you a sense of how I got started in trying to use some form of media to connect people. I was working for the Roman Catholic Diocese at the time in North Carolina in Raleigh, and we were literally building satellite receiving dishes. We didn't have other technological means for being able to connect people who could not physically come to the diocesan center or to the locations where we were offering resources. And we were fortunate at the time the bishops in the Catholic Church were building a satellite telecommunications network that we connected through CTNC, Catholic Telecommunications North Carolina, to be able to link parishes. It was a huge endeavor. We had these big 15, 20-foot dishes that were being installed in parishes around the state. We had cabinets that were filled with equipment, decoders and scramblers and videotape recorders and satellite receiving equipment. And we were training parish leaders to be able to use this technology so that they could receive programming that was being distributed nationally, so that they could engage audiences with topics that they otherwise wouldn't be able to have, and so that we could give the formational tools to folks where they were as best we could, because there were no seminaries, there were no theological schools anywhere in a 300-mile radius of where most of these folks were. What is nice is that we've moved to a much more compact size and shape. Today you can stay in your home working from your computer as you're doing today. You can even use your cell phones and iPads to be able to have access to the same range of resources we were trying to do by satellite that were being beamed up 18,000 feet into the 18,000 miles up into the air and coming back down. Now we can do it ubiquitously through the internet and through Wi-Fi technologies. And hopefully you can find access anywhere you need to when you need to do it. To do that, we need to be able to make sure we get everyone on the same page. And for today's group, I'm going to offer this as our housekeeping checklist. It's also a tool that I suggest you use whenever you're using web conferencing or webinar presentations, to be able to help folks know what to expect. You want to give some guidance about how to go down the road. And so I always start the room early. I typically will start at least a half hour early just so that I can get myself comfortable in the room. I'll try to set up the room in a way that I know it's formatted with all of the tools and resources that I need. If I'm doing a PowerPoint, if I'm having chat, if I'm wanting to see the list of attendees, I get that room all set up. I then invite in any presenters that I have, and we start the conversation as much informally as possible. In a webinar, we don't have as much of an opportunity for me to actually talk to you all at a distance, but with a web conference, as we'll show in some of the slides moving forward, there's much more of a chance for some banter so that I can get a sense of who you are, where you're coming from, what your questions and concerns are that help give me a sense of how I should gauge the presentation. I also will usually start with some basic technology instructions. More and more people have been using web conferencing, so this isn't as important as it once was, but the simple reminders of things like muting your phone or your audio connection so that you're not giving a feedback loop and distractions, being able to use chat for commentary and conversation. If there is any other process for interaction, especially in a web conference, we'll invite people to raise their hand and to be able to, when their name is called, offer their comments and conversation. I like to suggest that people pay attention to the television news anchors, because the television news anchors have a wonderful process where they usually say the name of the person that they want to have speak next. And when that person is finished, they tell the next person their name. That way you don't end up having people speaking on top of each other. And so unlike a classroom, we actually give a little bit more space. A physically gathered classroom, we oftentimes end up giving a little bit better space to the conversations of really listening to one another when we're in a facilitated room like this, because we've given a process for interaction that really encourages folks to listen and then invite the next person to participate so that there's an easy exchange instead of 5 people talking at once when you don't know who to pay attention to. As I said, there's also, when there's a simulcast, we want to make sure there's ways that you at a distance are feeling as much of a participant as the folks that are here in the room. And so for me to actually look at the camera, which is one of the most uncomfortable things in the world, is important so that you feel like I'm actually talking to you. When I'm in a web conference situation, I love being able to actually see all of your pictures online. And I'll have some slides that will show it. It's like the opening screen where we could actually engage one another. So there's ways of being mindful of who all's in the room. I usually like to have some sort of an agenda, and for today we're going to kind of break things into 3 parts. There's going to be a part where we're going to focus on some of the theory behind how you choose to create an online interaction with the different forms of webinars and web conferencings. And then we're going to walk through the actual tools that are available. I'm going to use Adobe Connect as the model so that you can see what some of the functionality is, knowing then that that's kind of a scale to evaluate other ones to see if they have comparable things that you would want to use when you're web conferencing. I always like to start on time, and that review of the agenda gives a chance. There are always folks that are not able to get in right away. If there are technical issues, that's where you have to make a judgment call of being able to decide, is this somebody that we can bring online, or do they need to listen just by audio? How do you need to make adjustments depending on that? We want to respect everyone that's in the room when they're in the room. As a caveat, that 30 minutes ahead of time is usually when I invite people who are new to web conferencing to come on early, so that you have some leisure time to be able to get them really comfortable with it. If you have the capacity to be able to do it a day or 2 ahead of time, all of the better. That way they aren't feeling like they're anxious coming into a space they haven't done it for, and you're not needing to deal with folks who are technically challenged as you're getting started a presentation. So those are my housekeeping rules. What I'd like to do to start, and I'm going to invite the folks in the room to do this with their neighbor, 1 or 2 people, and those online to do it through the chat. I'm curious to know why you're even asking the question about using online technology right now. So let's take a couple of minutes. I'd love to see, I'm going to watch the chat. I'm going to listen to some of the buzz in the room. Go ahead and talk to your neighbor about why you're thinking online is something that would be helpful for you in your ministry context. Thank you. So I need to bring everyone back together. Hello, everybody. The one comment that I'll share to the physically gathered group is that you sound like you're in a bubble, a water bubble, to those that are online. The buzz is like a filter for the aquarium. There's obviously a lot of energy around this question. And I want to make the caveat that we're talking primarily today about synchronous online connecting. There is a place for asynchronous, which is one of the comments that I saw in the thread that we will point to, but won't go into great detail with. And if anyone wants to explore that more fully, please feel free to be in touch with me. So online, I was seeing that there's a range of possibilities about where people are. Some are just exploring the possibilities. Some have been doing things like Bible study and clergy groups in online groups. There's also dioceses that created some regional centers and have been sharing resources through technology to those centers so that conversations can occur. I'm wondering if there's maybe one or two quick examples from in this room. Why online? Anything different from what I just said?
Sort of
and
administrative governance kind of things. I'm increasingly aware of people's travel schedules and serving on governing bodies and and either task force meetings or committee meetings where people are away, but they don't necessarily have to be away. If we make use of this much more
Great.
readily.
So the comment was about meetings. Online learning is not the only way we're going to use online resources, and especially if you have the technology invested in your community, to use it for multiple things is very helpful. I know I've gone many times where I've driven 2 or 3 hours for a meeting that was an hour and then had 2 or 3 hours to drive back home. That's not a good use of our time. So how in a compacted portfolio situation where we have way more than we can handle anyway, how can we help one another? And web conferencing is certainly a way of looking at that. So I'm going to keep going on. What I'd like to do is talk about the fact that access, I think, was what we're pointing to in many ways as one of the biggest challenges. Sometimes that's a perceived lack of access, and sometimes it's a real lack of access. I live on Cape Cod in Hyannis, and my parish covers all of the Cape. And it's an intentional community. There are local parishes that are closer, but a lot of our members come from a distance. Going across the bridge, which is there between Wareham and the Upper Cape, is a psychological barrier. People don't want to go across the bridge more often than they need to. And especially during the summer, you don't want to go across the bridge at all if you can avoid it, because the summer traffic triples the population on the Cape. One of the things we tried to do in our parish, and it's still getting up and running, is to break into neighborhood cells so we still can have some opportunities to physically gather and be able to have conversations and meals and share. Anytime you have a chance to be able to be physically gathered, and if it's an easy way to make it happen, there are certainly benefits in terms of developing relationships. That's, for me, the gold standard that we measure by. When you compare that to being on a phone call or not being engaged, web conferencing and webinars are much closer to being in a physically engaged environment, which is why I'm comfortable calling virtual incarnations as something that we really do want to try to encourage and support. We do get information, especially in a web conference where you can see and interact with everyone, that gives the body language, the nonverbals, along with the verbals, to be able to have those kind of meaningful relationships. There is a difference if you start knowing people in a physical context and move online than if you start online and possibly at some point get to physically relating with each other. That's not to say one's better or worse, they're different. And you have to be aware of that as you're planning what it is that you're planning. Obviously today I'm arguing that there are solutions to the distance barrier when we can't get physically together in webinars and web conferences. And the differentiation that I usually try to make between the two is that a webinar tends to be more of a broadcast-oriented method. Like today, where we have now 38 people online who are basically listening to me talking. I don't have the chance to actually talk with you, to see you. And so I'm broadcasting this program to you. We have some feedback loop through the chat, and that's usually the format of a webinar, so that there is a way for folks in the distance to be able to ask questions and make comments, but it tends to be a narrow bandwidth for the feedback loop. With a web conference, it's more fully interactive, where you can really see and talk to each other. I have a question in the room.
I saw a term that I've not seen before, a screencast.
A screencast.
How does a screencast differ from a webinar or a web conference?
Screencast, live stream, webinar, they tend to be similar. As I understand it, and this is where I'm still learning terminology too, a screencast literally is the broadcast of what is on your desktop without the video of me or the presenter being a part of it. So it's much more of a animated PowerPoint than it is something where you have some body language from the presenter being a part of the conversation.
Okay.
Sometimes there's a value not to have the distraction of the visual of the presenter. And sometimes it's helpful to have that presenter's image, feeling some warmth, feeling some connection to a real person that's talking on the other side. As a visual learner, I know I prefer seeing each other because I get a lot of my information from those visuals, and I miss it when I'm feeling like I'm the voice talking in the box of the room that has a disembodied presence as a part of it. With each of these, what I'm going to suggest, that different platforms have different types of interaction that are allowed. And again, I'm going to present a range of things that are the breadth of what is possible. When you look at different technologies, you're going to see that some can do some things and some can't do other things. And you need to be able to make decisions based on what is it you're trying to accomplish and using the tool that will help you to do that. A web conference that is participants only really gives a focus on the participants and the interaction among them. So with this screencast, you're seeing a class from the Episcopal Divinity School where there was one faculty member and 15 different participants that were all around the country that would talk to each other. The message and the things that they would share were often to start with a meditation or a prayer. And then in this particular class, they were thinking about how to write theology well. And so it was a coaching kind of a class where the faculty member was receiving information from each of them, giving them some creativity personally, and then they were sharing those documents to the group and having engagement with the whole cohort to be able to add to what the teacher was able to give. Usually in this kind of an interaction, like I said, there's homework ahead of time. There's some preparation that folks do so that what you're really focusing on is each other, not listening to information that's being shared. Starting with the check-in, doing some of the informal banter gives a chance of being able to establish a learning community. And then moving to get into the details of what the topic of the day is really gets the depth of what the relationships can be, especially when there's no distractions of other things to be watching on the screen. This is a great way of doing group spiritual direction, sharing faith in different ways, having had some preparation ahead of time. With the augmented web conference, it's very similar to the participant only, but there's more things to be paying attention to on the screen. I find this model works really well in meetings, as we were talking, where you can actually take notes and have an agenda visible for the participants to see as we're moving through it. I particularly love it when I'm the secretary of the group and I'm writing the notes for the meeting as we're happening, so that when it's finished, I can email that directly back to myself and have it ready to share with everyone within 5 minutes of the end of the meeting. It's usually good as a way to present materials, to record a conversation, especially for folks that might not be present, so that they can watch and have the full conversation, not just the short notes that might have been taken. It's a great way to track decisions over time and to be able to plan over time for next steps and actions. Bible studies, adult education, outreach committees, vestry meetings are all different ways that I've used this. In the webinar, similar to what we're doing right now, you're primarily focused on the presenter and the presentation. The majority of the participants are passive and they're receiving what is being shared. It can be good for a pastor's sermon or a conference. I particularly love it in a situation like St. Thomas More. I grew up where we would go to my grandmother's every Sunday morning on our way to church. She was en route to where we were going. And while we were picking her up and going to church and then coming back, we'd had the chance to talk with her and to be able to engage with what faith was for us. What I'm showing you here is St. Thomas More's Parish, which does a webinar, a webcast of their Sunday morning services. And it's particularly helpful in my family's context because my mom is one of those shut-ins. But the difference is, instead of the grandkids talking with her in the car as they're driving, my mother's in Pennsylvania, watching them as their community in Rhode Island is gathered for services. And then she's talking with them about what they experienced as they're driving home. So you never are really fully sure of what that Mass for shut-ins or what that resource for people who are not able to physically participate is going to do. But in our family, I can't tell you the amount of faith formation that happens, particularly in the intergenerational sharing in a half-hour drive from the church back to home when the grandkids and grandma are talking to each other. And it keeps her connected with them in a way that they would not otherwise be able to share. So there's a lot of ways from evangelism point of view that webinar can be useful in surprising ways as it takes it beyond what the actual distribution of the material is. Again, with the webinar, you can augment it. And this changes the focus from being primarily about the presenter to the interaction among the participants that are online. Right now, that's what we're doing with the chat feature. And hopefully there's some really engaging commentary that's coming on that I'll be able to fill in as I get to read it a little more closely to be able to see what's happening in folks. My preferred mode of being able to do a webinar is to be a host of an event like this where there isn't a live audience and I can put all of my attention to reading the chat and having the conversation going on to expand what they're hearing from the presentation point of view. Conference speakers, courses, workshops, this is an easy way to expand what's happening. Start from a diocesan presentation. I know a lot of dioceses are doing learning days where you have a whole series of people that are being able to help give skills to the volunteers that are part of your communities. Not all of those volunteers can physically come to be a part, but they might be able to have an hour to sit and listen to one of the more important speakers, or there might be a plenary that everyone in the diocese needs to reflect on together that could be shared, recorded, and then rewatched later for folks that don't have access. So to choose which one you want to do, a webinar versus a web conference, I teach people a mantra: message, method, then media. All too often I find people are starting with the technology, and in choosing the technology first, you automatically get a bounds of what it is that you can do that might change what you methodologically can actually accomplish and what the message is that you're trying to convey. If you start with what is it that you're trying to accomplish from a learning perspective in a teaching situation or from a communicating perspective in the message world, then look at what kind of interaction is necessary. Do you want people to be able to talk in small groups or large groups? Do you want to be able to have some text-based interaction? Are there visuals that you need to share? Once you figure that out, then supporting it with a technology that can provide that is the ideal way to be able to choose between a webinar or a web conference. You can also see that there's a difference in terms of information sharing and developing a community of practice, as well as presentation and interaction. And there can be blending of different styles of using webinars and web conferences, especially with some of the asynchronous tools, to be able to expand and fill out where you best need to put the mix together. A sample webinar format, and this is where I kind of think of structuring how do we use our time to be prepared. You want to be able to think ahead of time about different learning styles. Most people will say today that the visual is the most important, minimize the text. I struggle and try to put as limited amount of text as I can, but still put text because some of us are visual learners. And I know myself, I will remember the words that I've seen on the screen as much as the image. That is to say, we want images, but find a way to balance, not the death by PowerPoint text-based screen, but some balancing of colors and styles to emphasize the words. There's also ways that you want to get your presenters up to speed, doing some sort of a dress rehearsal days, weeks ahead of time so that they're comfortable with what's going on, as well as the day of, testing all of the equipment, being able to get everyone in informally, and doing some of that banter needs to be done ahead of time so that you're ready to start at the time you're ready to start. You then want to have your session identified. Again, this is an agenda that I've set up that usually works pretty well, and I'll encourage it. To have a formal welcome and introduction, especially if it's being recorded, you want to have that information at the beginning so that anyone watching from a distance knows who's speaking and where it occurred and typically what date it happened. Being able to have the technical instructions to be able to make sure everyone's comfortable with what's going on. Netiquette is the word that is used generally for being able to speak in a way that's not stepping on each other's toes, and being mindful in the internet-based world of how to engage information with one another. Offering some sort of an introduction. My preference would have been to have a map of the United States that you all could put dots on. And in an Adobe Connect format, that's possible. In a Zoom format, that's not. So that's one of the features that I'm lamenting is not available today, but I'll have to find another way to do it next time we do a presentation like this. Offering the presentation, having time for questions and answers, doing a formal close, so that again, when you're recording it, it can cut off at the end of that formal close, whether or not people are still saying goodbye or hanging on for follow-up questions afterward. And then debrief. Always try to find a chance to review, especially with the presenters, how things went from their perspectives, as well as if you can do some sort of a survey from the folks at a distance. With the web conferencing format, with a, I'm sorry, let me try that again. With a web conferencing course, the format of pre-prepared materials along with the live interaction is what I think is probably the ideal way for a course. The screen that I'm showing right now is a PowerPoint that has been adapted using a tool called Presenter. It's an Adobe product that allows you to create a self-paced module that can be uploaded to the internet. And then your parishioners, your people in your pew can have a chance to engage that, hearing you speak, hearing the information that they need, having time to reflect on it, which is particularly helpful for those who are more introverted learners, so that when you get together, you have a chance to be able to fully engage a conversation that's not catching them new without having a chance to prepare for that conversation. There's also usually some sort of a threaded discussion where you can have commentary going on. I think more of this is moving into a Facebook realm for a lot of communities to be able to share some sort of reflections back and forth. Facebook tends to be better for short conversations, 1 or 2 liners. A threaded discussion is more helpful if you really have some depth of reflection that needs to go on that you want to be able to engage. And there are tools like Moodle that are open source and Haiku that are no expense or limited expense for families and parishes to be able to interact with using. You then can follow up with the live web conference with whatever resources that you need. In the Adobe Connect world, we use the telephone a lot of the time because we have folks in New Hampshire and Vermont whose internet isn't very reliable. And as a result, by having the telephone interacting with the web conference, they've been able to participate whether or not their web conferencing worked on their computers. It also helps when people are traveling and you want them to still be able to participate. That's something that with Zoom, I'm realizing isn't as important. One of the reasons why I like Zoom is that it's a much smaller bandwidth user. So I am finding that people that are using their cell phones, their tablets, their desktop computers are having a much easier time in a low bandwidth situation, being able to engage and being able to use the voice over IP without having technical issues that oftentimes occurred with Adobe Connect. So that's one of the reasons why Adobe Connect, I think, has some limitations that the newer technologies like Zoom are going to be able to handle better. So that's one of the things to look at when you're choosing between the two. When you're doing these kinds of presentations, whether it's a webinar or a web conference, it's really helpful to know who is involved in the actual presentation. When you're one person trying to do the hosting role, the presenting role, the technical role, it becomes very challenging to do any of them really well, especially when somebody's struggling with some technical issues. So I, as much as possible, encourage having 3 different people. If possible, you can combine these, but you want to make sure the people that are combining them are really comfortable in each of them. The MC kind of manages the group and helps the facilitated conversation to happen. That banter that's really important for the informal time ahead of time becomes their place to kind of get the group warmed up. The presenter then gives the information and shares the materials in ways that are meaningful for them to share. And the tech support, much like Chris being our host today, is being able to follow and track things. He's going to remind me if there's questions from online. He's going to give me some timing cues to make sure I'm not speaking too long.
It's 2:40.
It's 2:40, so we're a little slower than we hoped. But it's a way of being able to work together. And that, I find, is an easier way for each person to know what their defined role is. There's also things you want to be able to be sure you know of what you expect from the participants. For today, everyone that's online came without any kind of prepared materials. If you're doing more of a course, adult forum kind of things, there's probably some work you want them to do ahead of time so that they're ready to fully engage into the conversation. There are ways that you want to mix up activities, and we're not going to have as much of a luxury to do that today. But an hour and a half is a long time to try to give attention when you're in a web conference situation. I would strongly encourage you never to go over an hour and a half, and if you do, don't go beyond 2 hours. Similar, I hope you all, well, I hope you haven't actually had this experience, but I know when I'm on a telephone conference call, there's fatigue that occurs after a certain period of time, and no matter how important the information is, I've checked out and I'm doing other things at my desk. The web conference, especially if everyone's live on camera, where it's really a web conference that's interactive, discourages some of that extraneous activity because you're visible on the screen. But the reality is you get tired. And if you don't have ways of breaking up the time with different kinds of interactions, it becomes really hard after an hour to really have successful information exchange. It would be better to set up 2 or 3 one-hour sessions than try to do the amount of material that would need 2 or 3 hours in a 2 or 3 hour block of time. Some of the tools for breaking up, and both Zoom and Adobe have this, but we're not able to use it today, is what's called breakout rooms. And so similar to how I had folks in the physically gathered room sharing time one-on-one with each other, we could, in some situations, make breakout rooms so that the currently 43 people that are now on the web could be broken up into groups of 3 or 4. It can be preset ahead of time where I could particularize different people in similar groups, or it can be randomized so that randomly you would be broken up into groups and you would have all of the ability to see and talk to each other in a small group and then be brought back to the large group. The one caveat I'll give you with breakout rooms is that you need to have an agreed upon time limit, and you need somebody in the breakout room paying attention to that time limit. Otherwise, there's an inadvertent jerk response when you're suddenly brought back to the whole conversation and you weren't quite finished what you thought you were sharing with a small group. So those are things to pay attention to as you're planning what those different activities are. I also encourage that these are opportunities with a so what factor. When you do a web conference, is it a one-off? Or do you need to pay attention to what follow-up there might be? Is there ongoing conversation that the conversation initiated that you didn't expect needed to have a continuing conversation, but because of the way the conversation went, you might need to? A webinar, it usually comes out of the questions and answers. With the web conference, it usually comes from the banter. With the teaching, there's lots of different tools you can bring online. In a Adobe Connect setup, I can bring all of these different tools into the room. The PowerPoint, the document sharing files that people can upload or download from Adobe Connect. I can put links in the room. There's live documentation as I described. You're using chat, whiteboards, polls, breakout rooms. You don't necessarily want or need to use all of these, but you need to think about if there are some of these that you need to use when you're choosing the platform that you're going to use to be able to share them. Some technologies like Skype cannot share PowerPoints at this point in time. So if having some information in a PowerPoint's important, you don't want to have Skype be the platform that you're going to be using. So, are there any questions at this point in the conversation? That's kind of a quick run through about what web conferencing and what webinars are, the differences and the similarities. I'd like to go into some demonstrations, but before I do, I want to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page. Chris, is there anything coming from online? And is there anyone in the room that isn't with me? Yes.
You said there's a difference between, this is a way back, you said there's a difference between when you have an in-person that moves online and when you have an online that moves to in-person. What's the difference?
I would make the conversation be more about how do we get to know one another. When you're physically in a room, there's some different dynamics about the way that we relate. The question was, what's the difference between meeting first in an online room versus meeting first in a physically gathered room? In a physically gathered room, there are a lot of things that happen by osmosis. We somewhat naturally sit down beside someone, find a way to start talking to them, figure out if there are any similarities, and then start digging deeper. When you're in an online space, you need to be much more intentional. It's like having the MC initiating some of the conversation with the banter, having some presupposed questions that might direct a preparation for what you're going to talk about in that online space, allows the space to start getting more comfortable. People come in a little bit anxious, a little revved up, a little not sure what's going to happen. You need to be more directive and more guiding in the way that the online space typically happens. In the physically gathered space, it just happens because that's the water that we breathe. We know how to operate in that space. We don't know how to operate in the online space. The other piece, and this is more for groups that continue to gather over time, what I have found by experience is that when I'm intentional about the conversations that happen online, I can get more in depth more quickly with the people that I'm online with. So there's a way in which some of the barriers that we have that protect us from being vulnerable have a way of letting go a little more readily when we're not actually right next to each other. And so some of that conversation can get deeper. Now, in a webinar, that's going to be less true than in a web conference. In a group that meets 10 times over the course of a month, as opposed to a group that meets 10 times over the course of 3 years, that's going to be different. So there's obviously nuances with all of this, but the more intentionality, I think, is what's driving the difference between the online form being first and the physically gathered form being first. Okay. What I have here on the screen is Adobe Connect, which is the platform that the Episcopal Province of New England has been using for the past 5 years. Like I said, it's a product I've been using for the past 15. It opens up, this one is customizable, so I can be able to set it up to be able to show what I would like for it to show. Whoops. Let me get out of this so that we can actually find it. It closed. So let's go back to find it. Technical difficulties, please hold for the technician to get back online. Here we go. So when I'm in a room that I've already opened up, this is the screen for Adobe Connect that shows you one of the other features about Adobe Connect that I appreciate. I have a different room for each of the different groups that I work with. I have a room for the book club, a room for faith formation, a room for our environmental stewardship, a room for what I call the water cooler, where we just want to banter. Each of those rooms is always set up the way we left it. So if we have PowerPoint presentations, if we have notes, if we have PDFs and documents that we've shared, those are always in that space available for the conversation to continue. So it's kind of like my bedroom where I have things in a certain place and I always know where to find them. When I come back to this room, I always know where to find them. With Zoom, you have one space that each of these different groups uses. So you have to clean the room for the next group to come into. It ends when the room ends. So that's a difference to weigh when you're choosing features. I'm going to take you into the room that we call the book club. During Lent, we did a study of Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. And what you will see in this room, it goes through a series of plugins. This is one of the technological things that people get frustrated with, because those plugins aren't always operating at the right time when they're trying to come in, and doing it ahead of time is helpful. This is the screen that they'd come into. I usually choose, like I said, to use a telephone, which adds to the expense, but it gives me more of an opportunity for participation. In Adobe, I can turn this off, but there's reminders of the different tools that they have available and how to use them. So even within the product, you have tutorials to help you to pay full attention to what's possible. In this room, I'm able to rearrange everything, which is another one of the features that I like about Adobe Connect. These boxes that have gray bars at the top of them are called pods, and I can resize them, I can turn them off, I can turn them back on. I can type into this space where the notes are. I can see who's connected. I can have chat.
And Knox says, does Adobe Connect have a free product?
Adobe Connect does not have a free product. It is a subscription service. The way that the province has set it up, we buy what's called an enterprise solution, which is a package of 5 licenses. And I have shared those licenses with other entities in the province as well as in the Episcopal Church. What that means is for basically $350 a year, whoever has that license can use as many rooms as they want for up to 100 people at a time.
So we have to convince our provinces to buy it, essentially.
Or team up. I'd be happy if someone wants to be able to use this through the province of New England to be able to share it as a resource. I know the church-wide office is using Adobe Connect right now for all of its committees, commissions, agencies, and boards and task forces. So there is some ubiquitousness about Adobe Connect, and that's another reason why it's somewhat of an advantage for people who have been a part of Episcopal structures, is that there has been some use of it regularly over time. Again, I think there's some reasons why watching Zoom and making a switch that direction probably in the next year or two is likely what I'm going to be doing, and I'd encourage folks to pay attention to that. Other products are set up with similar subscriptions, and there's some balancing you need to do to figure out at what point is which product the right for you. With Adobe, I never have situations where I need more than 100 people simultaneously online. I can have 5 rooms with 20 people in each, up to 100, or I can have 1 room with 100. It's the same price for the use of those regardless. If I want to go beyond that and have rooms for as many as we have gathered, there's 180 people who have subscribed to being participants in eFormation. I couldn't guarantee that I could have that in this group. And it gets very expensive if you need to expand Adobe Connect to that kind of a use. They will negotiate with you based on how your use is, but there's going to be some costs involved to be able to get larger numbers than 100. So that's a trade-off. There are also costs similarly for Zoom, for Skype for Business that have scaling, and you need to really weigh what is your use going to be to decide which platform it's going to use.
Our Assistant Communication Officer uses GoToMeeting for
Right.
that. I don't know if it's good for conferencing. I'm not sure about the webinar.
This is where GoToMeeting, Skype, Google Hangouts, I have found really good when you just want to do that web conference people only situation. So you're talking to each other in groups of up to maybe 10. Even in an Adobe Connect platform where I can have 100, I don't think it's worthwhile to have more than maybe 16, 20 at the outside, because as you get more people's visuals on the screen, their pictures get smaller. And you get to a point where the nonverbal information is meaningless because you can't see enough of it to get it. So 15, 20 people is kind of what I use as my guide. You can push it a little bit up and down. Webinars, it's a different ballpark. You're not seeing each other. So that kind of information isn't as necessary. GoToMeeting, Skype, they're great for those kinds of things when you've got smaller groups engaged, and they tend to be less expensive. I chose to get a platform that was robust, so I could do all of the things that I could possibly think about doing. We do a lot of educating online. We do a lot of meetings online. Having all of these tools is overkill if all I want to do is see and talk to each other. But because I have those other things, it's an added benefit that I have a platform that allows me to do that as well. So that's how to weigh the two. The other thing that I'll show you about Adobe that I like, and again, right now it's not a part of Zoom, here down the right-hand column, they have some presets. So I can literally script how a meeting or a teaching is going to go and have different layouts for each one of those situations. When we start the meeting, I want to prioritize the fact that we're seeing and talking to each other. So the webcam screen, where everyone would start their webcam and we'd see the tic-tac-toe like we had when you came into the room and started on the screen, gives you that ability to focus on the participants that are gathered. When we got into the actual talking about the book, I wanted to be able to think about the pages of the book. We can turn and have actual quotes shown on this share screen. We've got the questions for the book laid out in front of everyone. And so that gives a different engagement for folks to be able to see. The last thing that I want to show you is the recordings. The way that this is set up, I have the ability to record anything that's available. And when we did the book club, let me find where it is, there it is. I was able to record each of the sessions and to then publish those sessions online so that anyone who wasn't able to be a part of it could choose to be. Now, this book club actually got into some really in-depth conversations about race and racism. It was predominantly a white group. It was only a white group. And we spent some time talking about, is this something that we wanted to publish, or did we want some privacy to be able to have the conversations in a space to be able to explore what things were? We ended up deciding to record this, but not put it on the website. We have another series of web conferences that I call Exploring Multicultural Awareness and Nurturing Cultural Competency. And those are webinars designed for a lot of engagement, a lot of conversation. Those were recorded, those were posted online. So having a sense of what your needs are, why you would do things. Most meetings I don't record. Those two were things that were important to record. One was because the group had members that couldn't always make it and they wanted to keep them up to speed and they wanted to be able to go back and reflect on what was happening in their lives as they were part of the book study. The other is because we really wanted a public engagement. So those are things to think about as you're designing what you're choosing to design. Back to the slides. Adobe, like Zoom, like the other products, have pages that go through a great deal of information on how to use each of the features of that product. So as you're deciding what you're trying to do, if you want to learn more about how to do it, or if you've actually purchased a product and you're wanting to find out more, you'd be amazed at how much is on YouTube and on the product's owner's site to be able to help you to be able to fully take advantage of what it has available on the screen. These are the ones for Adobe Connect. There is an actual Adobe Connect users community. Again, the product's been around for years. Colleges and universities, dioceses, other church-affiliated groups, other businesses have been using this. And so these give a collection of the best practices, the exemplary practices of what they've been using. The Adobe Connect site on YouTube is particularly designed by Adobe developers. And so if you're wanting to see what they're thinking about new features, that's a way to stay on top of things.
Question, does anyone know of a product that is free and easy to use for a newbie?
What are you trying to do? It comes back to, the question was, is there a product that's good for a newbie? And certainly I would say start with using the basic tools that are free and see if they serve your purposes. So start with Skype, start with Google Hangout, get a sense of what they're able to do. But if you're really wanting to have more of an engaged learning, an online learning presence in the roles that you're in, you probably want something more robust, and it really is going to be worth the money in the long run to do it. I found, especially early on with Adobe Connect, that having what I call safe fails, places where I could try things and fail at them, actually gave me a better understanding of what was possible and what wasn't. And so fumbling around, especially with a friend who was connecting with me at 2 different locations to be able to try things, really gave me the best immersion at being able to figure out what was the product capable of, what did I need it to do, and how to balance what it was able to do with what my hopes and goals were for a way of interacting. So I understand you don't want to spend money prematurely. I also think it's worth investing a little bit. The benefit with Zoom is that they allow for some monthly subscription fees. So rather than paying for a year's subscription, which is the way Adobe Connect is set up, you can get into Zoom free. Zoom also has a tool that's freely available that you can use for meetings up to 40 minutes. It will cut you off at 40 minutes. But if you want to try to play with it and keep your conversations below 40 minutes, that's another way that you might want to try to learn a little bit about something that has a more robust capability. Any questions about Adobe Connect? Is there anyone that's been using Adobe Connect?
Actually, for information.
eFormation the last couple of years. Are there experiences that you've had that you'd share positively or negatively about it as a product? The comments that I've heard that typically get people frustrated, especially for people who aren't technically savvy, is that there's plugins that you need to put into your computer to make it operate. It's a Flash-based product. And Flash as a product is not a happy camper with a lot of other technologies that are out in the internet-based world. Right now, there's kind of a happy balance, but it seems that more and more the Flash-based products are not going to be compatible with the way that internet services are going. So I'm hesitant to continue to recommend Adobe Connect because it's completely Flash-based. And as a result, if you're trying to learn something that might in a year or 2 be out of sync, then you're getting yourself prepared for something that's not going to be available. That said, Adobe is a huge company. They've been adjusting to the circumstances of their day as they've been forced to do so. So I will be surprised if there isn't some sort of an upgrade to Adobe Connect that doesn't take advantage of the current context that they're operating in, but it's something to watch as you're making decisions. Zoom is a much more nimble platform that doesn't have as many capabilities, but it's more in keeping with where the new technologies are being developed. So it's worth paying attention to that, having most of the features that Adobe Connect has without having some of the problems that Adobe Connect might have.
This is probably very obvious, but I'll say it anyway. Early on when I was using it and I was mostly a participant, I was on a phone and I didn't necessarily have an ear thing, earbuds or earphones. And that was okay, but once you get into where you're hosting or doing any kind of leadership in it, you really do need them. And I think that by now most people are using them anyway, but early on my experience was many of us were for the audio part of it, we're holding a phone, a cell phone or a landline phone and participating. It doesn't work in the leadership role particularly well.
So for folks at the distance, one of the comments that was shared is that especially early on when using a telephone in Adobe Connect, it was common to hold the phone to your ear or to have it on speakerphone. What the limitation of that is that any kind of noise that happens in your context will be picked up by that phone, along with whatever conversations are being shared could be heard by anyone that's passing by. So being aware of what those constraints are, whether you're using voice over IP with speakers or you're using telephony, you need to pay attention to the context that you're operating in. And are you going to make it private so that folks in the area don't overhear what's being heard? That means you probably want to have some form of earbuds and microphone to be able to be presenting, rather than hosting in a public space with a phone or a voice mic that could be picked up by anyone and could be heard by anyone.
Using Adobe Connect as a participant and then switching to another platform for other things, you really do appreciate the nuances. One thing in particular, I know on some platforms, the person who is talking zooms in large and kind of obliterates all the other little Brady Bunch squares. Or if you need to type a chat, you need to toggle between video and chat. And so being able to have everything open at once, I think, is really important in a interactive environment.
So the comment that's being shared right now is that in Adobe Connect, you see everything all at once, and it's there sized the way that it is. So it's not moving, it's not distracting from that point of view. It might feel distracting to have that many things on the screen, but they're in place in a way that you know where to look when you want to pay attention to pieces. Some of the other products will change the format. With Zoom, I need to have actually have another computer opened up so that I can see the chat, because I don't want my screen share to be being broadcast with the chat to everyone in the room, and therefore hiding some of the things that I'm showing from my screen share. When you're online yourselves, you're probably having that chat overlay with what you're seeing on your screen. With another product, it takes the person who is speaking, I think this is Google Hangout, and it makes the person who is speaking big, so you know who the speaker is, and the rest get minimized. So when people are talking, especially if there's some rapid conversation, you've got this constant movement of people getting big and small and big and small and big and small. They can become very distracting to the conversation. So again, it's important to be able to play with the different tools, to be able to figure out what works in the context that you want and what you want to prioritize. I think Hangouts has a way of turning that feature off, but you have to go into the settings to be able to make sure that that happens. And that's where you only know it if you spend time playing with it. Any other comments or conversations? Okay, let's see where we are here. Why is my screen not moving? There we go. This is the website for Zoom that allows you to see where you can go. And one of the things that is nice about Zoom is that they've actually created some handouts for you that might be useful for you to be able to use. So here is, whoops, where did it go? The Zoom page has all sorts of tutorials, again, similar to Adobe Connect, for figuring out how to use their product. And then they have a list of best practices, which I will open up. And a lot of the things that we've talked about are here in a PDF document that you can have as well as you can share. And that's one of the things that's another trick of the trade. When I invite people to be able to join me into a web conference, I usually send instructions ahead of time that give them all of the information that they need to think about. How do they connect? What are the steps to connect? Make it, again, as comfortable as possible so that they're not feeling unnerved about how to join this group. Adding a sheet like this that tells some of the best practices both helps you as a planner to have a checklist to go through, as well as to have something easy to share with your participants so that they can have a sense of what they're coming into also. Whether you use this or you create your own participants users guide, I think that's a nice way of being hospitable. And the more hospitable you are, just like you are when people come to your house and help them to find their way around, the easier it is for folks to feel confident in being a part of the conversation you want them to be a part of. They'll focus on the conversation rather than how to get to the conversation. And that's the piece with either a webinar or a web conference to pay attention to. So if I go back to the PowerPoint, The last piece that I want to share with you is 310, great. What I have here is a Wikipedia comparison of web conference products. Early on in my career, I was doing this myself on an Excel spreadsheet, and I can't tell you how crazy making it was every couple of months to try to go back and figure out, now what's the newest technology and how does it compare, and is it something that I need to continue to follow? And it's crazy making. What somebody generously has done is created a similar comparison, and they've added all of the different products. The last couple of days I've been going through this to try to get a sense of if it's up to date, and it does seem to be fairly extensive and up to date. You might want to spend some time looking at the different features and being able to choose among some of these different products to see if there are things you want to experiment with. There are some sites that you can go to, do a Google search, because they change every month depending on who's published the more recent one. But if you search current web conferencing tools, you'll usually find in some of the tech magazines their ratings for what's currently being developed and being released. I have found that this document tends to include most of that pretty rapidly. So it's a time money kind of question. How do you want to spend your time? This gives you a way to go directly to the product. So if I click on Zoom, it takes you to information within Wikipedia about it. They can give you a sense of where they are and where they're going. The products typically have been slanted because they're using information from the company. So you probably want to find some external tools to put in conversation with the information that's on a wiki. But it gives you a great starting place to know the questions you might want to ask as you're trying to compare which product goes with which use that you want to have. Some of the premier products that people have had a lot of time using, I'm sure you've all experienced Skype. Google Hangouts has a strong following, especially because it's embedded in a platform that allows for a variety of other kinds of interaction. You can do desktop sharing, you can do document sharing, you can do a lot of team collaboration on materials. Having Hangout be a way to bring those things in and out might be a resource if you're a more meeting-oriented kind of conferencing, where working on the screen is more important than seeing the information on the screen when you're seeing each other. So that's one of the reasons why Hangout hasn't developed a lot of the tools that Adobe Connect has, because they have this other background supplement to its resource so that you can still do those kinds of collaborations. I think that's pretty much covering all of the pieces I was hoping to. Let me get back to my PowerPoint. The last slide that I wanted to have before opening it up again to questions and answers is this slide that shows my website. I have a company called M3, M3. It's for message method then media. The website allows you to be able to find a lot of the resources that I've created for the teaching and learning that I've done. I tend to use the internet in the way that web blogs were originally designed. I use it to store information to make accessible to other people. I do update this. It is not a weekly update, it's more of a periodic update. So as I get new information that I think is relevant to share, I put it up. When I do a new presentation, I update the materials and I make it available to you. Faith Formation 4.0 is the name of a book that I wrote. It's looking at how has formation been influenced by the 4 different eras of human communication. So you know we started as an oral community, and there are different characteristics when you're sharing in an oral community than when you move to a written one. In a written world, you can distance yourself from the story that is who you are when you're in an oral culture. Mass media, print, radio, television, tends to be more of a broadcast-minded way of doing things, and it tends to have more of an authoritarian mode than what is the interactive age. Faith Formation 4.0, the fourth era, is the interactive age, where the internet allows anyone to be a source or a destination. It makes it more challenging for us in churches to have shared authority when everyone can be a source or a destination. It's more important to help have criteria for evaluating what it is that you're hearing and knowing how to interpret those things in an interactive age. So those are things to pay attention to. This blog goes through all sorts of resources for each of those four eras. On the page under consultants, it has some of these resources for web conferencing. I've put some of the information from today's presentation onto that site, and in this next week, I will be adding more of what we've done today to that site. So feel free to go back to that location. If there's any further questions or comments that you want to have, feel free to be able to interact with me using that site. So with that, I'm going to open it up. Are there any last questions or comments that people want to make or offer? Based on the
I have a question, and my question is virtual church.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of interest in members or non-members streaming us from around the United States. And we're really thinking of how to enter or work on possibility of having a virtual church. These individuals from Philadelphia, California, all over, and they've been streaming us for a long time. And we've been getting messages that they would like to come from them. So the question is would this be the best possible way of doing it?
Right.
Because there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. One, if they are an experienced Christian, then they would come on board and we would have to have them hook up to the new member class before they receive the right-handed fellowship. That's not particularly the big question. The big question is if they come in church as a new believer, the question will be, how do you get baptized?
Right.
So that's something that we're really pondering and looking over.
Can I ask what tradition you're talking from?
Baptist.
From Baptist. Okay, so for the folks that are at a distance, we have a Baptist minister who's here speaking with us about the question of virtual church. And how can web conferencing help or not people who might be coming in either as unchurched or as having been churched from places all around the country, from California, from Philadelphia, from New York, from Chicago. What is the concept of virtual church, and how can technology be able to manage that? The good news is that people have been asking this question for a while. Since the internet became a means for being able to engage, there's been a lot of experiments going on from a lot of different directions. And I have spent some time particularly in a virtual world called Second Life, where there actually are representations of churches with avatars and people engaging one another with it. Growing up Catholic, where Mass was being streamed on the television, similar to what I described as my mom being online with the internet for television, there's lots of ways to be able to have the information side from your communities be able to be shared. So the challenge comes particularly around sacramental moments, things like baptism. What are the criteria that we in our communities have for making something a valid, illicit introduction to and membership belonging of our communities? And that's a struggle that each community is going to be experiencing. Excuse me 1 minute. I am embarrassed to admit that that is my reminder that there is a forum going on. Tom Brackett is a missioner within our church that every week. Every Tuesday, he gets online at 3:30 with ministry developers to be able to talk about how they're doing in their ministries. And that was my reminder that I'm supposed to be on the call. Oops. Anyway, within virtual church, it's coming back to some struggles around how do we recognize what is valid and illicit. There's a book called Sim Church, S-I-M Church, that really explores a range of ways that people have experimented in a church where communion is important, where bread and wine are shared. The book gives the example of, is it valid for someone to have bread and wine sitting in front of them at their computer screen while a presider blesses it in some form at some other location, so that when you consume, it is truly the body and blood of Christ, for traditions that believe that. You can imagine the range of challenge as well as support for trying to make the Eucharist available to anyone who feels like they want to be able to be a receiver of it. That's a communal reflection and decision-making process. In a tradition like the Baptist Church, it will be more of a local decision. In a decision in an Episcopal structure, it will be much harder to do because it will be more of a church-wide decision. There is, because of the Anglicans of Second Life have a church that the Church of England has been watching for 15 years now. And they're really struggling with it because they have people who are a full community that are engaging one another on a weekly basis and in their lives supporting them to go out into the world, and they're trying to figure out what that means. So the challenge comes back to you. What is the criteria that you use for identifying a member? And are there surrogates that you would have that could be present physically with someone who needs to be baptized? That could be an envoy that would go out like Paul into the world to be able to baptize them and then have them still connect with you through a virtual means. You need to reflect and be creative about what are the things that are important for you and your tradition, and how do you find ways to mediate that so that you can welcome the folks that want to be in communion with you in a way that's appropriate for them and for you to be able to continue that engagement.
So are you saying from a surrogate perspective, are you saying to potentially have one of our ordained licensed reverends fly out to the location, utilize a church that could be
Correct.
in that area, and then fly back?
So the follow-up question was, am I suggesting that an ordained licensed minister from their community goes out? And I would say yes. And I would suggest that you do the reverse of the web conference. So instead of them being the recipient of the information for their classes, now they become the site of the source. And you have a web camera that's there when the licensed minister flies out to baptize them and broadcasts it back to the community so that they can celebrate as it's happening, what is happening in a creative way. So you have a way to honor your tradition with the representative bodies that need to be present, and the whole community is enlarged because of the way the practice is done. The challenge with people at a distance is that you need to find a way to have regularized communion. Whether it's in word or in action, how do you stay connected? And that's what the technology can do, which it goes back to the intentionality. How are you intentional about the relationship? What are the things in that relationship you want to be intentional about? What are the non-negotiables that are important to who you are as a body? And figuring out how to do that can happen when generous-minded people come together to be creative about the ways we can explore what is important in new ways. Anything else? I think that's time. We're now at 3:30, so we've done well. I really appreciate your chance to join with me in talking and thinking about ways of extending who we are as church together. And I'm happy to field questions. As I said, My email is jlytle0214@comcast.net, and I'd be happy to talk with folks after this. So thank you.